Hey everyone, David Aragona here for the March 20th edition of Horses to Watch, where we take a look back at trips from the last week, trying to find horses that encountered adversity in the races and might be worth following or potentially betting back in future starts. Well, this week I've got a quartet of replays to look at, and they're all from Santa Anita in Southern California. Don't often spend this entire show at one racetrack, but saw plenty of interesting races at Santa Anita over the past week and a half or so. Actually, all turf races, and we're going to talk about a variety of circumstances, some horses that had trouble at the start, ones that overcame wide trips and greenness. So plenty of different angles to discuss on this episode. We'll begin with a race from actually 2 Saturdays ago. This was March 9th, the fifth race on the card, and actually a horse that we've already discussed on Horses to Watch 2 weeks ago. I highlighted the number 9 Real Fire, and we'll take a look at her when she came back for her next start in this optional claiming race, going a mile on the turf for fillies and mares. She is the number 9 this day. And now, when I first highlighted Real Fire on this show, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, it was for her effort on March 3rd. So just 6 days prior to this. And that was a down the hill 6.5 furlong turf sprint. And what I had said about Real Fire at the time was that if you watch her races coming down the hill, she reacts very badly to those situations. She gets too rank in those races, doesn't like being behind horses, and just seems generally uncomfortable racing down the hill. And I proposed the idea that maybe she would be more comfortable going 2 turns, maybe stretching out to a mile. Well, the connections did exactly that, but they ran her back just 6 days later in a situation trying the 1 mile distance. The problem with this race that we're taking a look at now, when she stretches out to the mile, is she just gets a different kind of wrong trip. You saw in the clubhouse turn, she never was able to save any ground around that first turn, went 3 to 4 wide from her outside post position, and she is uncovered every step of the way. What that means is she's not following anybody. She is just has daylight in front of her, and she's got that kind of trip while racing outside of horses that are covering less ground than she is while hugging that rail. And as they come around the far turn, you see once again she is stuck out in the 3 path. That's a really difficult trip to pull on the turf in general, but especially around a 7/8 turf course like Santa Anita, where saving ground is so important, and you just can't lose ground around both turns like this and expect to be successful. And Real Fire, to her credit, she hangs in there until about the 8th pole and just gets a little bit tired at the end of this race. She was a big price this day. Apparently the bettors did not agree with me that she was interested in coming into this race. They sent her off at odds of 41 to 1, but she outran those odds to actually finish this race in mid-pack, losing by only about 2.5 lengths. I still think that this filly, or mare, I should say, is better than her recent performances indicate. She actually ran fine in that 6.5 furlong race 2 back. Umberto Rispoli just had a really tough time riding her that day. And then last time out, Jeremy Laprida was aboard and just could never really get inside from that outside post position, was really dealt a bad hand at the post draw. I think that Real Fire is better than she looks. We'll see if she possesses the class to win at this optional claiming first level allowance condition. But I do think that she's a horse that will be generous odds when she comes back next time and is likely to outrun those odds once again. Let's move on to a race from last week. This is the first of 2 races we're going to take a look at from the Friday, March 15th card at Santa Anita. We'll begin with the first race of the day. It's a maiden special weight going 9 furlongs on the turf for 3-year-old fillies. We'll break these runners from the gate and focus on the rail horse, the number 1 American Dreammaker. And you can see highlighted right here, she veers in considerably at the start and just barely stops herself from running right into that temporary rail before hooking up with the main course. And that's not unusual for this filly. She has broken slowly or awkwardly in all 3 starts of her career. This is now her 3rd attempt to break her maiden, and we've seen similar antics from her each time, getting away slowly, being a little bit out of position. I know she was a horse that some handicappers had interest in second time out after getting this kind of trip on debut when she was off slowly and then running on greenly at the end. The problem with a horse like American Dreammaker, who has had trips piling up, is that she's not learning from her mistakes. And I'm going to highlight her as a horse that I do think has more ability than she's going to show in this replay, but I think she's the kind of trip horse that you do want to proceed with caution around in future starts, because you do want to see eventually her start to take those mental steps forward. And one thing I'm talking about watching this replay is not just the start of this race, where she was obviously a little bit green and unprofessional, but from this point forward, she's getting a decent trip towards the back of the pack. This was a race that featured a fairly fair, even pace scenario. So she's got some chance to catch up to this field, but she's not going to be done any favors by showing some reluctance to run through traffic as they progress past the half mile pole here into the far turn. You're going to see there are a couple of long shots ahead and alongside her. The horse that's right in front of her is actually going nowhere. That horse is under a heavy drive at this point. An American Dreammaker is getting subtly shuffled back, trying to follow that tiring runner into the stretch. But even here, when her jockey, Juan Hernandez, angles her out to come around between horses at the quarter pole, you could see she's not really changing leads on cue. She was hanging on her left lead briefly. Even when she changes over to the right lead here, she's lugging in through the stretch. You could see Juan Hernandez is having a tough time riding her through the final eighth of a mile here. She's trying to lug in on him, not really wanting to run around those horses to her outside. She ultimately finishes up pretty well to get up for fourth in this race, making up a good amount of ground. But you just don't want to see that level of unprofessionalism now in the third start of a horse's career when they already showed those tendencies on debut and haven't really learned from those experiences from start one to start two to start three. So potentially there are further changes to be made. Trainer Micah McCarthy might want to add blinkers in a subsequent start. That could potentially add a little bit more focus to this filly. But I do want to see American Dreammaker take a step forward very soon if she's going to fulfill some of the promise that she has shown in these races where she's gotten poor trips, like last Friday. Let's take a look from another race from that Santa Anita Friday card, March 15th. Race 8 was a starter allowance event, $50,000, going a mile on the turf. And we're going to take a look at another horse that we've already discussed previously on Horses to Watch. That is the number 8 Single Track Mind. We can break this horse from the gate and check out his performance from this day. And he's a horse that we initially talked about back on January 6th when he had gotten a wide trip in a race where most of the best running was down towards the inside. He raced once since then in February, ran pretty well, but that was going a mile and a quarter, though. He'd finished just off the board, and 10 furlongs probably a little bit too far for Single Track Mind. He turned back to a mile here at an appropriate class level in this starter allowance race, but unfortunately encountered a different kind of bad trip for him, and that was getting caught behind a slow pace. He is a one-run closer, and he's a horse that can be at the mercy of slow paces when they develop, and unfortunately, that's exactly what he encountered in this race from last Friday. The horse who got to the front end of the number 7 Mubtada was one of the favorites, 2-1, and he just got away with murder on the lead. If you take a look at the Timeform US pace figures for this race, they are all color-coded in blue, indicating that this was an extremely slow pace for the distance. And the jockey on Single Track Mind, Umberto Rispoli, does everything in his power to get this horse into the right position and give him a chance. He's not last in the early stages. He's within contact with the rest of the field, trying to save some ground around the far turn. But when he angles out at the top of the stretch to finally make his run, he's just not really able to close that much ground on horses who had already saved energy and had better position on him coming into the lane. You could see here, he angles out about 5 wide at the top of the stretch and unleashes a pretty good kick to try to come after these horses, but just is not able to catch the winner, the number 7, while making up mild ground on the second and third place runners to ultimately get up for fourth in this race. I maintain that Single Track Mind is in better form than his recent results might indicate. Definitely ran better than it looks back on January 6th. Like I said, that 10 furlong race probably too far for him. And then once again in this race, he was closing best of all of those trying to make runs from off the pace. Unfortunately, that pace scenario just did not develop in the right way for him. He's going out for a barn that typically does not take money, so he's been big prices in all of these recent starts, and I think he's likely to be one next time if he's back at a similar class level. So Single Track Mind, even though he's had multiple trips, is one that I think you do want to give one more chance to if he finds himself in a race with a little bit more pace. Let's finish up Santa Anita by talking about one race from their Saturday card last weekend, March 16th. The 7th race of the day is a maiden special weight event going the 1.125 distance on the turf for 3-year-olds. And as we break these runners from the gate, focus on the number 5, Indispensable, and his disastrous start. You could see his nose actually goes right into the dirt, and he goes to his knees at the start of this race. This was a race that was contested on the turf, and unfortunately, he lost it at the one part of the race that was not being run over the turf. That dirt break from the gate just really did not work for this horse at all, and he finds himself towards the back of the pack. Ironically, he's a horse who should have been very familiar with breaking from the gate on the dirt, because this was actually the first turf start of his career after having made about 4 or 5 starts on the dirt to begin his career. But getting on the turf does seem to be what this horse wants to do. Unfortunately, he was just cost the victory this day by that disastrous beginning. Now, he finds himself very far back in the early stages of this race after getting away to that troubled start. This was a race that did feature pace ahead of him. If you look up this race in Timeform US, all of the fractions are color coded in red. So this was a race that could set up for a closer, and I think it did set up for indispensable pretty well from that standpoint. But still, I think you want to give this horse some credit for getting as close to the winner as he ultimately does at the end of this race, given how badly he got away from the gate. Now, he's got pedigree for the grass, as I mentioned. He's by constitution. His dam had produced a turf runner. There's turf in the second generation. So it made sense that they would want to get this expensive horse onto the surface because he had shown some talent on the dirt, but wasn't really fulfilling that potential that he had shown in that purchase price and in the mornings. And it did seem like he took a big step forward on the grass here, because you can see as Joel Rosario starts to ask him for run coming to the top of the stretch, he's winding up with a big move, gets bumped right there a little bit, but is still determined coming after these leaders through the final eighth of a mile. And he just continues to pick up momentum as they come onto the wire, ultimately getting within a length of the leader, but just falling short of getting there as they come onto the finish line this day. Now, this is the kind of trip that I don't think is going to fly under the radar. I think a lot of people are going to notice this trouble that Indispensable had. So he's not the kind of horse that I anticipate is going to be some huge price next time, but I do think he's one that is likely to do better in his subsequent start on the turf. So those are all the horses to watch for this week. If you want to follow any of these horses moving forward, you can add them to your horse watch on DRF.com, or if you can go into your DRF formulator or Timeform US past performances, you can make notes in the notes feature on both of those past performance products, and those notes that you make about these horses' trips will show up in the running lines for the past performances when these horses come back for their subsequent starts. But that doesn't mean that you just have to follow the horses that I highlighted in this video. You can use some of these principles that I'm discussing in these horses to watch videos to go and watch trips for yourself, because watching trips is one of the biggest advantages that you can have playing the races in this day and age. So everybody, thanks for watching Horses to Watch this week.